this is why you should read especially, there's a new little book out on Zen, edited by Lucian Strike. What's the name of it, Jano? It's prayers, poems. Yes. Well, yes, this has got some very good things in it about how the great masters insist that for everything you seem to have attained, every great insight, every great ecstasy, you must drop it, let go of it, and immediately go ahead. Because in the end, thank you. If you think that, here it is, Zen, poems, prayers, sermons, anecdotes, interviews, by Lucian Strike and Takashi Ikimoto. Very good. But they insist on the point that so long as you think that there is a state of affairs in which you can say about the big thing, whether it's God or whether it's Nirvana, Brahman, the divine, the Tao, I've got it. You haven't. Because the moment you regard it as some sort of object, some sort of state, some sort of thing which you can lay your hands on, you put it away from yourself. See, the one thing you can't lay hands on is you. You never find it out. In a million years, you can't find out who it is that wants to find out. And who it is that wants to find out who it is that wants to find out. Never get at it, you see, but that's the thing. It's the thing that is most close to you. As Francis Thompson said, nearer is he than breathing, closer than hands and feet. So what is absolutely central to you is what you can never make an object of knowledge. And so when you finally get to the point that you don't have to have anything, because you're it, and you don't even need to insist on yourself that you're it, because if you have to insist on that, it means that you doubt it. You don't have to go around saying to yourself, be still and know that I am God, or something like that. That's for beginners, see? That's for beginners. But when they really get to the end of it, there isn't a trace, see? No means are left, no methods, no getting hold of it. No meditation, no LSD, no nothing. Because it's just the way it is. But before a person sees that, then means are used, whether it be yoga, whether it be chemicals, whether it be anything else. So let me sort of sum up. In the last analysis, all spiritual awakening involves something beyond the will and the ego. You cannot do it yourself. So it makes little difference what you use for this. Some ways are easier than others. It's easier if you use theobotany, a divine plant, than if you just bang your head against a brick wall. But with the very ease of it, there is the danger that you may neglect the discipline that must go with it. In the banging your head against a brick wall method, they are sure, at least, that you know the discipline before anything happens. And so that is the danger in a relatively easier way. But of course, as Aldous Huxley once said, to insist upon using the more difficult ways to attain the mystical state is rather like having to burn down your farmhouse every time you want roast pork. The problem for us is that we don't have the split between the role of priest and the role of physician has left both roles impoverished. And so there is nobody who's really competent to deal with death or to deal with preparation for death. And that's what makes it a problem for us. Finally, that the most subtle danger in all these things, whether it be yoga methods or whether it be chemical methods, is fixation on ecstasy. Not to know how to go beyond ecstasy and beyond looking at the divine as something that one can possess personally.
I was saying yesterday that psychedelic experiences tend to have two aspects. As a matter of fact, you can classify their effects in many different ways. And people who say there are 3 things to be remembered or 4 things to be remembered about so-and-so are really making this in order to put a point across these sort of classifications. There are always 530 things to be remembered about anything. So don't take this too seriously, but I'm doing it to make a point. And these two aspects are, on the one hand, the alteration of sense perception, and on the other hand, intuitive insight. And if we could say that the intuitive insight is the aspect of psychedelic experience that corresponds most closely to the natural mystical experience, which does not necessarily involve the types of sensory alteration or alteration of perception so often involved with the chemicals. Nevertheless, it's hard to draw a very straight line between these two aspects, because every so often the sensory alterations suggest some kind of insight. I first of all want to go into the nature of some of these alterations, typical alterations, and discuss them. But first, you are aware, I suppose, that these chemicals are often classified as hallucinogens. That is to say, chemicals which generate hallucinations. And this has seemed to me a very bad word indeed, because of course hallucination always carries with it some kind of condemnation. It's a pejorative word. And I have rarely come across an instance of where the use of LSD or mescaline or psilocybin has created a genuine hallucination. For a hallucination is the appearance of something to a particular individual unseen by others, which he believes to be part of the real world. In other words, if you saw a ghost, it might be claimed that this was a hallucination. If you took the ghost as really out there. But things like that don't tend to happen. What might be classed as hallucinations are of two kinds. Visions seen with the eyes closed. But of course you know that these are visions. You know that you are under the influence of a brain-altering chemical, and that therefore unusual things are likely to happen, which you are not going to mistake for events in the external world. And therefore, when you close your eyes and behold the most amazing patterns constructed out of jewels, moving with splendid order in the dark, or see infinite complexities of ferns, where the stems sprout fronds, and the fronds sprout fronds, and the frondlets sprout frondlets, and forever and forever and forever, or marvelous arrangements of crystal arabesques, translucent, colored balls moving in space in many dimensions, enormous temples, vast architectural creations with every kind of wall and tower and cauliflower, going on forever and ever, through gigantic spaces, getting involved in thistles with prickles upon prickles forever and ever and ever, visions of Persian palaces, of courtyards, of arabesques, of dancing girls and angels and knights in armor, all sorts of fantastic things will appear before closed eyes. But you know all the time that these are visions. And of course they create the most extraordinary questions. What are they? Because although they are visionary, although they aren't there in the external world, they very much are in the internal world, and they must have some kind of neurological basis. What are we looking at when we see those things? This is a question which nobody knows how to answer. For in some way there must be a physiological basis for this kind of patterning? Is it that we are getting a glimpse of patterning processes within the brain, processes which organize our ordinary thinking about things? After all, you know that when you use the telephone and you dial somebody, there is a machinery which handles it all, but if you go and look at that machinery, you'll find it has an extraordinarily interesting design. The patterns of electronic equipment are sometimes very beautiful. But you're not aware of those patterns when you make a telephone call. You're aware of voices, and that's it, and bells ringing. So it may be in the same way that within our minds, our brains, there are perfectly marvelous pattern organizations which we become aware of only under special circumstances. In other words, what one tends to do under the influence of a psychedelic chemical is to become aware of being aware. That is to say, you turn your senses back on themselves. And one is only inclined to do this when there is an alteration in the normal form of perception. That is to say, in seeing, you do not notice your eyes. In hearing, you do not notice your ears, especially if they're healthy. But if some disease should attack the eye or the ear, or some temporary inconvenience, and you see spots in front of your eyes, you know that those spots are within the structure of the eye, and if there is singing in your ear, you know that that singing sound is within the structure of the ear, and this turns the sense upon the sense. So in exactly the same way, if something alters your normal way of seeing things, your attention is diverted from what you see to seeing itself. And this, of course, this awareness of awareness, the turning you back upon yourself, even at this still rather superficial level, is the beginning of a process of self-exploration and self-knowledge. But it takes a little alteration to do it, as it were, to fasten your interest, because when your eyes are seeing perfectly, there is nothing to fasten on, you see. The eye creates a visual space of total clarity and emptiness, although that's all inside your head. And you find it difficult to attend to that which has no distinctive features. But when an alteration is introduced, there is some new distinctive feature to sight. But these are very hard to pin down. I gave you an illustration last night of the feeling that everything is at a funny angle. When a picture, as I said, is out of alignment, you know it's wrong, it's queer. Now, supposing everything gets out of alignment, and everything has a sense of being funny. I don't mean funny ha-ha, I mean a bit funny queer. Everything is just odd. Just a little bit odd. It's as if everybody had suddenly grown pointed ears. And not only people, but everything has pointed ears on it. Little projectiles sticking up from these pointed ears. And, you know, that's elfic, that's foxy. It's something funny. And leaves on trees suddenly have all pointed ears, see? If you get this sort of impression, it's very strange and very hard to pin down. So one of the first inquiries that is always interesting in the psychedelic state is to discuss with yourself what is the difference between this way of seeing things and the normal way. And you can get a group of people sitting around and talking about that. And it becomes one of the oddest conversations because people can't quite pin down what it is. They all agree there's something funny. Everything's a little bit off, and yet it looks the same as it should look, but it's off. And what do we mean by that? We really don't know. And it would be very difficult to establish a physiological basis for this. It might be done. But you see, it's like, as in the same way as when you put on colored glasses, everything becomes colored with the color of the glass. And soon, your consciousness will start to eliminate that effect. And it will begin after a while to look normal, as it does when you wear sunglasses. So in the same way, if you put on a glass for every sense that you have, and the name of that glass is funny, everything will look funny. And but nevertheless, this discussion, what is the difference between normal awareness and funny awareness, focuses you on the whole thing of awareness, on the whole process, which does not ordinarily happen. unless you do meditation practices designed to do exactly that. So, another thing that is comparable to this that happens is what I would call the feeling that everything is significant. Now, this is a funny word. Taken literally, significant means something which serves as a sign, which signifies something other than itself. I say this is a very significant remark that you've made, means that it has a deep meaning. But there is another sense of significant which means important, valuable, interesting, in that sense. Now, how can you possibly describe a state of mind in which everything appears to be significant? Logically, this is absurd, just like everything being off-center at a funny angle. But nevertheless, however absurd it is logically, it is nevertheless a characteristic of this state. For example, let's supposing somebody reads. Somebody sits down and reads poetry. Well, you see the meaning of the poetry in the ordinary way. But you also see a lot more than you normally notice. That is to say, every tone and texture of the reader's voice, every clearing of his throat, every pause to take a breath, every gesture is integrated into the poem. It becomes important. It becomes significant. It is as if there were some sort of signal system in the brain which attaches cues to various experiences, so that you know, for example, the difference between a direct experience and a memory. Because some experiences have the here and now cue attached to them, as when you sit and look at somebody. Other experiences, as when you close your eyes and remember the face of a friend who's not here, they have the memory cue attached to them. So you know that that's not a here and now. Well, so in a similar way, our experiences, we attach to them cues. Important, notice this. There are other cues, unimportant, don't bother. Or perhaps no cue at all. Now, here in this state of consciousness, everything gets cued. Everything. Everything you look at becomes important. And you realize that it's only an arbitrary kind of human scheme of selection that says these things are important and those are not. Because everything is important to something. You then get this curious sense, you see, that it doesn't really matter what you look at or what you listen to. Anything will do. Only there does remain a residue of value judgment, so that you're still capable of saying, I would rather look at this than at that. But if it so happens that you, just for the sake of experiment, choose to look at what you would rather not look at, it in turn becomes absolutely fascinating. Among the other alterations, I've thought of quite a number of them. I mentioned already the motion alteration, where the world seems to breathe, where walls seem as if they were made of cloth with an electric fan behind so that they wave, where the pile in a carpet, if you look closely into it, every little bunch of threads constituting pile can start to wiggle. Now, similar to that is what I would call the experience of grain in the senses. Once I was in this experiment, and I was looking at the mullions in windows, like here, you see. And although I wasn't seeing any more mullions than there actually are, I wasn't seeing double. Nevertheless, the arrangement of one after another gave the impression of doubling. It was like seeing double. And yet on account, I counted the same as a person in the ordinary state of consciousness. but one seemed to be a replica of another, of another, of another, of another. And the same would be true in looking at any sort of regular pattern in a carpet or whatever. And then the doctor said, look at hold up a finger and see if you see that double. And no, I said no. Yeah, oh, but yes. But what I had seen was that just beside my finger there was a wisp of cigarette smoke. And this wisp, being just at the same height as the finger, right here, became a basis for an eidetic image of a second finger. In other words, just the same way as you work the Rorschach blot into all sorts of shapes, so I worked the Rorschach blot of smoke in the air into a second finger beside the first. And for a moment it seemed just like it until I detected the source of the illusion. This led to examination of stones. And very quickly I suddenly somehow got into the impression that the whole space of the visual field seemed as if handfuls of pebbles had been thrown into it. And the whole visual space was constructed out of ever so many interlacing concentric circles. You know, for example, in the way that color pictures are sometimes reproduced. There are several techniques, and they depend on the various kinds of screen that are used for printing. Well, there is a type of screen that is made up of ever so many circular patterns, all interlocking and intermeshing with each other. And so the whole visual world seemed to be based on a screen or grid of this kind. Now, the interesting thing was that I could not at any point isolate actual lines in space forming this grid which did not coincide with some ordinary sense-perceived object. In other words, there was nothing to be seen that would not ordinarily be seen. And yet my eyes had organized what is ordinarily to be seen into this pattern of ever so many concentric circles. It's as if, in other words, when you listen to an alarm clock, you know, the old-fashioned kind that go click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock, click, clock. Now they don't. They go click, 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 click. But you hear click, clock, or tick-tock, because your mind resents the monotony of tick-tick. And then, you know, very afterwards you can rhyme doggerel to this clock, and you can hear tunes in it. It becomes the beat, and you fit tunes in with the beat and things like that. Well, in just the same way that you do that, so your eyes can organize what they see into patterns which we would say in the ordinary way aren't there. They can pick out waves, as I see a row of people sitting with their heads on top. There's a thing like this, you see, rippling right through you. See? And ever so many things like that can be done. And so you start, when you see that, asking questions. What is the right way to organize the way you see the world? Everybody running around and agreeing, of course, that they see the world the normal way and the proper way. Yes, but is this actually so? After all, it's an agreement. Supposing we had agreed to see it a different way. See, because the world, as I've often said, is essentially an enormous Rorschach blot. It's profoundly wiggly, except in places where men have tried to straighten it out by building straight walls, straight highways, and so on. But the natural world is wiggly all the way through, including our own bodies. Well, how are you going to interpret these wiggles? How are you going to decide how much of a wiggle constitutes one wiggle? What is a unit of wiggle? You see? So we apparently what has happened in the course of many millennia
is that persuasive human beings have said, well, now, look, this is the way it goes, and everybody's got to agree with me. Surely this is the way it goes. And everybody says, because this guy is kind of rough, yes, that's right, that is the way it goes. And so whether these people were powerful physically or powerful persuasively, we've all more or less agreed to see the world the same way, although we have not agreed yet, you see, to speak the same language. We're still using an enormous number of different languages. But these things, you see, these organizing patterns which we project upon the world are, as it were, the languages of another kind. They are patterning methods, methods of thinking, structures of thinking, which we use to organize the external world in exactly the same way that one uses the string bag of longitudes and latitudes in which the world is hung to organize it, or the celestial latitudes and longitudes to organize the stars. These webs, these grids are fundamental to organized thinking about the world. Numbers, you see, are a similar kind of patterning. And the mathematician knows all kinds of patterns, lattices, matrices, and so on, which can be used for organizing things. So, another aspect of this grain experience in the senses is what I would call pointillism. You know, pointillism is a school of painting that was invented in France, especially associated with the name of Seurat, where the painting is composed of minute dots in many colors. And this is a very common psychedelic phenomenon, similar to the concentric circles that I just mentioned, to see everything consisting of points. Once again, you are not able to specify, actually to put a needle point on any one of these points. And yet everything that you see, the ordinary vision of the world, seems to be made up of minute dots. And you begin to wonder. You know that after all you have many nerve ends. All over your body there are endings of nerves, and these are especially sensitive in the retina. And you wonder, am I becoming aware of the multiplicity of my nerve ends, of every single unit that picks up the external world, and therefore I see in the external world a point corresponding to each one of my nerve ends that picks it up? Well, it might be that. But as you think about that, you are liable to get fascinated with the idea of one nerve end. One point, one, as it were, basic unit of sensitivity. And I have christened this basic unit the eeny-weeny. The eeny-weeny is a fundamental, you might say, unit of conscious life, sensitive life. And when you begin to think about this one unit of conscious life, very extraordinary things begin to happen. Because you realize, well, we've got really down to simplicity now. We've got this, as it were, one fundamental point, which is what's called in Hindu philosophy a bindu. B-I-N-D-U. Bindu is an atom, but not a physical atom in the sense of what our physicists mean by an atom. This is an intellectual atom, the finest that any grain can get. It's almost like the Euclidean point, having position but no magnitude, except that it isn't quite as abstract as that. The eeny-weeny is very much alive. It is a unit of, and I use this word, to indicate what is common to all senses. A unit of sight, of sound, of touch, of taste, of smell. And all these senses, as you begin to realize with psychedelics,
are really one sense, specialized in 5 different ways. That's why you, in certain cases, hear colors, see sounds, and so on. It all seems to go together. Well, of course, it would, because they're all specializations of our basic sensitivity. All senses are fundamentally a sort of touch. So the eeny-weeny is a fundamental unit of touch. Now, as you know about a neuron is such that it can give either yes or no as a message. That is to say, either it fires or it doesn't. So then the eeny-weeny is like that. It's either black or white. But you begin to see that it's both, because black always involves white and white always involves black. So this eeny-weeny is one but two-faced. Also, its being one implies all the others. One implies many, because you can't think one unless you can think many. You can't think many unless you can think one. The concepts are inseparable. One doesn't mean anything unless you know what many is. Many doesn't mean anything unless you know what one is. So suddenly the eeny-weeny, being one, implies all the others, and being itself, it implies an outside which is not itself. But if you can't have the outside without the inside, in other words, if you can't have the space around the eeny-weeny without the eeny-weeny, and you can't have the eeny-weeny without the space, then somehow it's very difficult to say that the eeny-weeny, the one little unit, and everything else are different. They're not. They go together. And this leads you into the most fascinating of all aspects of psychedelic experience, which I will call the experience of relativity. This gets us back to significance. What is important? Now, we human beings think we're important, and that we have a very complex civilization. That our libraries, our cities, our organizations, our institutions, our nations, our wonders of religion and philosophy and art and architecture and so on, is the most complicated and the most significant thing that ever existed on Earth. And when we look at and realize that there are little cells in our bodies that have a sort of independent civic life, and that there are all kinds of microorganisms, which when we see them, we don't see the familiar human shape. We see something more or less globular. We say, well, that's a very primitive shape compared with the shape of man. It doesn't have a highly organized nervous system as ours, and therefore is obviously an inferior creature. But with a psychedelic, you have time to think about things you don't ordinarily think about. Say, now, not so hurried, not so hurried. How do you know this thing isn't as complicated as you are? You haven't really looked. Start looking. And we know a scientist can start looking, and he can find that one small, tiny microorganism is very complicated indeed. And why wouldn't it be that from the point of view of this microorganism, its affairs are extraordinarily complex and very important? I mean, imagine just something that we know a lot about that's a long way from a microorganism. Let's consider a bee. What do bees know about subtle distinctions between different kinds of honey that we've never thought of? Supposing a bee is arranged that it does exactly what it likes, and yet at the same time this is always socially acceptable. A pretty groovy sort of civilization there, wouldn't it be? You never have to stop to think, would this offend anybody or anything like that? You do just what you feel like doing, and it's everybody accepts it. It's perfectly fine. You play the rules automatically. Well, human beings would say that's not much of a challenge. After all, it's
Well, it's more significant if you could do something wrong, if you could make a mistake. Well, that's our way of thinking of it. That's our particular taste, that we think it's more fun to play it that way. They may think it's more fun to play it the other way. They say, well, what do you want to introduce all that nonsense for? When you can live a perfectly satisfactory life like a bee, why do you want to go and bring in a kind of principle of evil choice just to make everything messy? Well, it's another form of game, you know. Every game has some kind of a forfeit in it. You've got to lose something in order to find it, or to win it back. Now, that's the essence of a game. That's why you shuffle the deck of cards at the beginning, to create chaos. So, and then you work against it, you see. So everybody has something, some kind of thing that's a forfeit, to play their life game. Otherwise there'd be no game, you see. We think it's important to survive. Well, it isn't. Yeah, but we say so, you see. It doesn't make the slightest difference whether you live a short time or whether you live a long time. After all, here are these fruit flies, Drosophila. They come and go, come and go, come and go with extraordinary rapidity, generation after generation in a few days. And, from their point of view, this is perfectly satisfactory, normal life. Because I think the same about myself. And if I cannot assume similar processes in other creatures which are going on in me, then I'm reduced to total solipsism. That is to say, there are people who argue that although you can learn Chinese, you will never, however much you study Chinese and however much you speak with Chinese people, you will never do anything really that understands Chinese, because you weren't born with it. You're always translating it into English. And so you're permanently precluded from understanding another culture. Well, you can carry that argument right down to understanding another person of your own culture. You say, well, he's another person, and you never really know another person. And so we all are broken up into island universes, which have no real communication between each other at all. Well, the only reason I reject that is that it affords that basis is a game rule which has very little play. In other words, it's like, it's as boring as tossing to see whether it will be heads or tails. But the assumption that other people and other cultures really can be understood, and that the further assumption that things that are not human, that maybe insects or mammals or fish also are highly civilized, is a far more interesting assumption than that they're merely creatures of no importance. But so you see, though, that it is an assumption that we ought to go on living, and that but you see, it's a meaningless assumption when you really examine it, because mere going on, mere quantitative length of time is just so much time. It has no special qualitative meaning to it. So we say a person died a glorious death. He died for some great cause, you see, and whoom, he went out, you see. But we say that thing that went on for a few minutes, short life, he was a young man. He went up in a bang, but it was a glorious explosion, and everybody builds monuments to him and says he was a great man. See? So there is a value then to the short and explosive, as well as to the long and dull raw kind of scene. But when you're really fixed on a game rule, you see, like you ought to go on living, it's very, very difficult indeed to see that you really don't have to. To see, in other words, what this so often comes down to, this relativity. Well, let me postpone that for a moment. I want to further the idea of relativity. So what you see then is that at every level of being, all creatures are confronted with the same tasks and have the same
problems and are really in the same situation. The infinitely small is as big as the big can be, and the big is as small as the small can be. Because after all, when you get down, 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 down to the most minute things you can conceive, it turns out that they are surrounded with spaces that are relatively as vast as the spaces between the bodies of the solar system or between the different galaxies on the large scale. So if there are beings of any kind of sensitivity dwelling on these minute points of whatever, they will look out, and what we see as galaxies will not be visible to them at all. They will find themselves in the same sort of universe we find ourselves in. Because the kind of, you see, every creature that is sensitive finds itself in the middle. See, each one of you is in the middle of the world. Because you radiate a sensitivity. In other words, the extent to which your eyes will see, your ears will pick up sound, is always a circle or a sphere. And you can expand that sphere by instruments, telescopes, radio astronomy, or whatever it may be, telephones. But still, you are in the middle. That's the most important place. Everybody's in the most important place. The middle. And we say man is the measure of all things. It's a funny feeling that man stands in the middle. Of course he does. He knows, as it were, so much higher than himself and so much lower than himself. Probably equal in both directions. So much bigger, so much littler. So when you get down to very tiny, that thing too feels in the same place that you do. But you might say, oh well, but really it's very tiny, because after all we are fairly tiny, and there may be, in other words, beyond all the galaxies that we are aware of, vast systems that we have no knowledge of at all, and they are after all bigger. Are they? Are you sure? Bigger? Or are they just the same place? You see? Eventually you can construct a scheme where you get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that bigger is the same place as the tiniest. It goes round in a circle. That's, you might say at first, difficult to think about, but it is a perfectly logical concept. Perfectly simple, only it's unfamiliar. So is the sense, you see, as this grows, you realize that everything is in the same position. I remember I was thinking about this once, and at the same time listening to Hindu music. And the concept of this immense relativity was really moving in me. And I was full of marvel at it. And it was somewhat terrifying. Somehow the Hindu music is very deep stuff. You have to have quite a trained ear to go and see that it is something just as profound as anything written by Bach or Beethoven. But I suddenly said, you know, there are moments in this music when God himself calls out for help. I don't know what I meant by that, but something like this. In the Hindu philosophy, as you know, they believe that God plays hide and seek with himself, and that he, for as it were half the time, whatever time is, anyway, half of it, he gets lost deliberately and forgets that he's God. And he gets as lost can get, you know, which is the end of experience that we call the screaming mimes. And that's when God calls out for help. Well, immediately he answers, of course, because he wakes up and finds out who he really is. But what you begin to see through this relativity thing, that everything is central, everything is as important as everything else, however big, however little, you realize it's all God in the same position. But now that begins to scare you, because you say, well, I can't believe that I'm God. That would surely be very blasphemous, because after all, I'm not very good, and God's supposed to be good, and I am not very powerful, and God is supposed to be all-powerful. And you say, what do you mean you're not powerful? It isn't a question of whether you're powerful or not powerful. Powerful and impotent are just two opposites of the same game. If you didn't feel some lack of power, you wouldn't feel any power. I mean, you couldn't be all-powerful, because that would mean nothing. There would be just nothing happening if you were all-powerful. But when power and impotence, to be able and not to be able, are two phases of the same thing. So in the same way is the voluntary, what I can do, and the involuntary, what I can't or can't help doing. They are phases of the same. You wouldn't know one without the other. And you begin to see, yes, isn't that fascinating? And then in a funny way, you begin to realize it's a sort of secret, that you are willing what happens to you without your will. Because you see that you couldn't will anything unless there was also that was other, that you couldn't will, that was beyond your control. And it begins